Good afternoon. Welcome back to Senate Education on Thursday, January 18th. We're shifting gears to school safety in Act 29. We have Ms. Barbic with us, the Director of Violence Prevention Task Force, and her team. Ms. Barbic was instrumental in our work last year. Huge help to us as we move forward. And what we thought we'd hear today is a bit of an update, how Act 29 is rolled out, things you're seeing, any concerns, any particular successes, and anything that you think we need to address legislatively going forward. And just as a review, we'll just go around the committee, because I know there are a few new people here, so everyone has an opportunity to know who's around the table. Start with our new attorney.
Hi, Nader Hashim, Senator from Windham County.
Sure.
Martina
please.
Rock-Ulrich, Senator from Burlington and Chittenden Central District.
Brian Campion, Bennington County District.
Dave Weeks, Rutland County. Terry Williams, Rutland County.
And we'll just pick it up with, want to introduce yourself, Finn?
Finn, Orca Media.
Please.
I'm Sunny Erickson with Public Safety and the Vermont School Safety Center.
Yeah, okay, I'm Mike McGrath, I work for the VPA.
Colin Robinson, Vermont, NEA.
Dan Beatty, Deputy Commissioner, Public Safety.
Lindsay Hedges, Vermont Agency of Education, and my colleague Jill Rick Campbell will be joining us shortly. She's just running a little late.
Terrific.
Rebecca McBrown with Vermont MEA.
Brendan Everwine, legislative intern.
Liz Mills with Stats and Redbird Consulting.
Thousand records.
Stats and Redbird Consulting.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Dee Barbic, and I'm the Director of the Violence Prevention Task Force. Within the broad scope of violence prevention, school safety has been a large part of the focus for my position. As you recall, there were several major sections to Act 29, which was passed last session. And those sections covered a number of different areas to include options-based response drills and fire drills, access control and visitor management policies, the development and maintenance of emergency operations plans, and training and policy development for school threat assessment teams. The work related to the many parts of this act, including drills, developing EOP, emergency operations plans, which I will refer to as EOPs, and threat assessment training started years ago prior to Act 29 coming into effect. That work was done through a grant, and that grant was awarded to the Department of Public Safety, specifically to do work on assisting schools in developing their emergency operations plans, providing an emergency operations plan template that was available for schools on the Vermont School Safety Center website. Workshops were held designed to assist schools in developing their emergency operations plans, and it also included behavioral threat assessment training. Again, this was all prior to Act 29 coming into effect. Since the passage of Act 29, the Vermont School Safety Center and the Agency of Education have done an incredible amount of work together on the implementation of the Act. This included continual collaboration with schools and stakeholders during this process. Much progress has been made in the development of policies, reporting, updating the EOP template to include a guidance document, and continued training for behavioral threat assessment teams. There's still a lot of work ahead. Sunny Erickson of the Vermont School Safety Center and Jill Reeves Campbell of the Agency of Education, both Jill will be here to go into more of the details of the specifics in terms of the work that's been done thus far and work ahead on Act 29. I was going to turn it over to Jill. She had a PowerPoint and was going to go into some of the nuances and details of what AOE has been doing in terms of Act 29 implementation.
Please, Senator Gill.
I have a question that's not specifically on this topic. It is around safety though. I just happened to be listening to National Public Radio the other day, and they were talking about the successes of anonymous tip lines in stopping potential violence in schools. And I was wondering if that's paying back.
We do have one. It's Safe for BT. And that is an anonymous tip line and the calls are answered 24/7. There's a process of identifying, where that call needs to go. If it's an immediate emergency, it would, go to law enforcement. If it needs it's a high immediacy type of event, or if it's someone who's reporting concern, and there are a number of avenues that can go, but they're vetted and then they go to the appropriate location or entity that would appropriately do that.
Awesome. Do we have any data around?
Like how many calls?
Yeah, how
And
successful?
I don't have it on hand with me, but I can get that data for you.
Thank you.
Any other questions that I can answer? Again, the details and nuances of the work that's been done has been done through AOE and the Vermont School Safety Center is outlined in the act. So I would leave those very specifics to AOE and Vermont School Safety Center, but happy to answer any sort of higher level questions if you have any.
Yeah. I have heard anecdotally, I have no numbers to back this up, but I have heard that it's been difficult to put together the behavioral threat teams. I don't know if you've heard anything or if you can speak to that at all, but.
I can't speak to how difficult it's been. The training has been offered, and continues to be offered through 2024 and is scheduled out for that. There was a very in-depth, thoughtful process on developing policy, and that policy hasn't come out yet. But it involved a lot of work with stakeholders, a very large group of stakeholders, so we could get input from a number of different entities and perspectives. It went out for public comment in December, and it's currently with the Agency of Education Legal to utilize that policy. So I think that policy will go a long way in clarification for that. And again, Lily is not to, and the Vermont School Safety Center together very collaboratively in this effort to guide schools and provide as much support for schools in this implementation process.
Hi. Apologies, my meeting invite said 4. So I was upstairs.
Oh.
Something we like to do.
Because I'm always early.
Help
So,
you before.
yeah, that's all right. We
30.
planned for an easy segue.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dee.
Apologies.
Yeah, Jill Briggs Campbell, AOE Director of Operations.
Yeah.
We have sent over a pretty extensive slide deck, which I do not plan to go through slide by slide. The intention there is to sort of remind us of what is in Act 29. It's somewhat complicated. I have it open on my desktop pretty much every day and always have to remind myself of each of the sections. But what I was thinking we could do, and please let me know if this works for you, is sort of go through each of the sections and provide a little update on what we've done, what's upcoming for 2024, and then hopefully leave time available for you to ask questions if you have any. Does that work for you?
Works for me.
Okay, fantastic. So as I'm sure Dee already signaled.
And would you mind bringing that up on the screen so those watching could?
Yes, I think we sent it, or do you want me to try to share? I'm not in the Zoom meeting.
If I can share it, but you'll just have to tell me when.
Sure, absolutely. And I'll try to go through it. As I said, I'm not gonna go through slide by slide. I'll go through somewhat organically, so I'll try to shout out when I'm hitting a particular slide. One thing I wanted to signal is just a sort of brief reminder for us on the second slide, consideration of the hierarchies, because there's a lot of different language included in Act 29. So obviously we have state law is sort of preeminent. Under that are policies. Policies are passed by school boards, either public school boards or independent school boards. Generally speaking, AOE does not develop model policies unless directed to, as we are in Act 29. Sitting under policies are procedures. Those can be adopted by school boards or school SUSDs or independent schools themselves. These tend to have an additional level of detail, right? So there's the you shall do this at a high level, and the procedures basically lay out how you do it. And then under that are guidelines and best practices, and AOE, Vermont School Safety Center, other state agencies tend to put out these guidelines and sort of frameworks for how should you do it. And within Act 29, all of those exist. So I just wanted to call those out. All right, so what's in Act 29? One thing I did want to highlight, because it's a bit unusual for us, is that Act 29 applies to all Vermont schools, both public and approved and recognized independent schools. I'll be coming back around kind of throughout the presentation to some of the challenges I think that our independent schools are going to have in implementing Act 29 with kind of same level of rigor and fidelity. And it's not for necessarily lack of trying, it's for a lack of experience with doing some of these pieces of work. So the first sort of top three sections include options-based response to violent intruder and fire drills, all hazards emergency operations planning, access control and visitor management policies, and we've got quite a lot of work done in that area already. Then the last section of Act 29 is centered on behavior threat assessment teams. I know you all took significant testimony on that, and we've done quite a bit of work there, but I would say a lot more to come, and I'll be sharing some of those updates with you. And then the last section, which is not included in this presentation because it's not my workload, is Act 29 creates a working group on student protections from harassment and discrimination in schools, and that's a separate group that's doing that work. I think you've already, in previous testimony, heard from our partners at VSBA that some of the initial timelines for Act 29 were pretty aggressive and were really challenging when schools were actually not in session. So some of those initial timelines were July of 2023. And I will also call out that we had a historic flooding event starting in July 10th. And as it so happens, a lot of the state personnel that are involved in the implementation of Act 29 also happen to be the emergency response folks. So for example, Sunny Erickson is also part of Vermont Emergency Management, my operations team, and I'm the director of emergency response with the AOE, and my operations team is as well. So we have to acknowledge that created a delay, but I would say we've got our feet under us now, and we're actually really digging into this work, and I think that we're on track. So just a few kind of high-level considerations. I'm going to, bear with me, we're going to skip down to slide number 5. And one of the initial pieces of work that we needed to do was identify a process whereby schools could indicate that they were meeting the requirements of Act 29. And we did that this year through an assurance process. Are we matched up? Yeah, we are. Great. We did that through an assurance process, and that's been an iterative process, and we're actually now in the phase of checking the math, right, and ensuring that all of our SUs, SDs have completed their assurances, our independent schools have completed their assurances, and now we're in a follow-up round of work. So it was intended to allow respondents to certify their compliance with several key elements of Act 29, specifically those initial ones. It did also acknowledge that some of those initial dates for implementation were going to be challenging, if not impossible, when school was not in session. And so it allowed independent schools or SUSDs to indicate sort of a future anticipated compliance, and it asked them to identify that date. And the date was not, 2027, right? The date was January of this year. So now what we're doing is we're identifying who indicated future compliance, and we are reminding them of their obligation to complete that work and to update their assurances. It also included a requirement that if they've already developed a policy or they've adopted a policy, they upload that policy. So we've got some data there. And it also asked the respondents to indicate if they have a current behavior threat assessment team. That was not information that we had a really good handle on. And as I'll indicate as we move through, there's some work that they're going to be asked to do in relation to that. Moving on to section 1. This was the section that required each school board that operates a school and each approved and recognized independent school shall adopt a policy mandating options-based response to violent intruder drills and fire drills. The fire drills are something that we develop in partnership with other state agencies, and it's an annual thing, so there isn't a lot of update there. But for the options-based response to violent intruder drills, there are some updates. Those drills must be age-appropriate, trauma-informed, and options-based. The Vermont School Safety Center offers a lot of guidance and best practices around this work. So when schools reach out and say, how do we do this? We can direct them towards those resources and our partners at the School Safety Center. It also required notification to parents not later than 1 school day before a second drill. So, and finally, I'm sorry, it also requires that schools, as they complete this work, report that they've done it to the Agency of Education. We've created a drill reporting tool, and we will be doing sort of follow-up on that biannually. So they should report by January and by June, and then we go off to checking insurance compliance there. So I'm going to skip to slide 8 and just sort of indicate what is the work that we've completed to date. We did partner with the SBA to develop a model policy. I think that Sue Sadlowski, again, this happened right as the July flooding took place. So there was a mismatch in time between when the school boards first drafted their sort of initial policy and did a lot of work to try to get that passed versus when we released our drill guidance, which was in September. And that was purely a result of the flooding, just a lack of capacity at the state. When we identified that there was a mismatch between those, we immediately partnered up with the SBA and they were able to adjust that policy, and now the two things match really well. So I think that was an example of maybe a little bit of a bumpy start, but actually the strong partnership that we've developed with them, which we continue to have ongoing. We also, again, released our annual guidance in compliance with Act 29. We also presented a webinar and provided resources for independent schools around all of the different elements of Act 29. This is a place where they need additional support. Many of our schools are starting, I would say, at minus square one. They might not have an emergency operations plan at all. They might not have an access control policy at all. And I'll talk about some of the specific challenges that they're facing in terms of access controls. So we recognize that was an issue. We've been holding additional webinars and sort of support opportunities for them. And they are actually reaching out to us and to our partners at School Safety Center, sort of asking for some advice and how do we do this, and having Rob Evans available as a consultant to sort of talk them through, like, this is how you might create access controls in a space that's a shared space or a leased space. Those are some of the specific issues that our independent schools have faced. We've also offered a similar webinar to public schools. They have, as of this moment, declined because they've got their hands full, but we'll be circling back to them, of course, and we're always in close contact with our partners at VSA, BPA, and VSBA. So in terms of work plans, so on slide 9, based on feedback from school partners, there may be a need to create a small schools working group led by the School Safety Center to develop procedures to support student safety, develop emergency operations plans. Many of our independent schools are very, very small. You know, their staff might consist of 2 people, 3 people. Many of them lease their spaces. Many of them operate within shared spaces, things like a church or a community center. And many of them highly prioritize, I think as many of our Vermont schools do, sort of a combination of indoor-outdoor learning taking place within the community. So how do we balance that? Really, it's a strength of our Vermont education system with some of the requirements of Act 29. And so that's, I think, where our small schools, whether they're public or independent, could use a bit of additional support. And so we might actually be creating sort of a community of practice around that. As I said, we're in kind of the oversight and compliance mode when it comes to the assurance. So who's reported, hasn't, we'll be using that data and turning it into a public dashboard at the end as one of our compliance and oversight measures that we have. I would say that an additional challenge for some of our recognized independent schools is they're not used to this necessarily this level of engagement with state agencies. And so we're going to have to do some additional touch points and outreach with them. All right, moving on. Section 2, emergency operations planning. So the requirements are that each SUSD and or independent school, both approved and recognized, shall adopt and maintain an all hazards emergency operations plan. It must be reviewed and updated on an annual basis. And key component here is that it needs to be as comprehensive as the all hazards emergency operations plan template, and it must be developed and updated in collaboration with local emergency first responders and local emergency management officials. This is critical. One thing that we certainly have identified in the experience of the July flooding, and then again in December 18th in the rain event and flooding that happened there, is our experience in working with probably the top 10 most impacted districts is that where they had longstanding firm relationships with their local first responders, when we would reach out to them and say, do you know where your kids are? Do you know what families are in need? They knew. Even though school wasn't in session, they knew because they were in touch with their local first responders. They had longstanding relationships with them and it was in their emergency operations plan. So as the fire department was going door to door, they were identifying, oh, we have 3 minors in this household. We need to let the school district know. And they were able to almost immediately start to provide supports. Other districts, not for a lack of trying or effort, do not have those same kind of levels of relationships in place. And so there's a artificial disconnect that exists there. And so part of this reason for this engagement is because we've seen the way it actually plays out in real life and the way that it can impact the ability of schools and communities to support students. And I'll also say at the state level, it impacts our ability to get good data, right? And to know when we are working with task forces and we are working with FEMA and American Red Cross to be able to say, we know we've got 23 kids in Johnson that have been impacted and we need to ensure that they're getting fed, clothed, sheltered, right? And that brings a level of detail to our ability to respond. So all around, it's going to have a key impact. Where we're at with this is that we are in the process of completing a major revision to the current emergency operations plan. We've split it into a template, which is something that I want to signal this, we're not starting from square one with our public schools. Pretty much all of our SUs and SDs already have an emergency operations plan. So for them, this is going to be a process of revision, improvement, ensuring that they're maintaining, that they're doing training exercises, et cetera, et cetera. For a lot of our independent schools, this is starting from square one. And so we provided a template that they can use that will result in an emergency operations plan and with it a guide. How do you do this work? And as part of this, they will also be, we've already got these scheduled, Vermont School Safety Center has these scheduled through spring of 2024. The Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools, REMS training. These things go hand in hand, right? You take the REMS training, it tells you how to do emergency operations planning, you identify your team, you work on the plan, you make revisions and updates, and you have your local first responders and emergency management officials involved in the process all the time. So, work plan for 2024, these REMS trainings, and I'm on slide 13 here. If you're following along at home. REMS trainings for schools and local disaster management and first responders are scheduled. They're starting to run. There'll be ongoing technical assistance from the Vermont School Safety Center with specific supports for small schools who may need to identify how they're going to have these robust plans. On the AOE operations team side of things, we will be aligning the requirements of EOP plan and templates with our district quality standards. So
Senator Kulik has a question.
yeah,
I hate to interrupt.
no, please go.
You were doing such a nice job. Has there been talk about the fact that maybe like small schools need a different option?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we are actually doing that review live right now. Well, I think we have a meeting scheduled, I think on Monday. So yeah, we're going to be going through that template and identifying, first we need to sort of define what is a small school, right? And maybe there's different levels, and then go through kind of this universal template and try to identify what are the places where, you know, maybe a micro school, like a very tiny school, might not need to have X, Y, or Z, or this is how they could do X, Y, or Z. So
Sorry,
yeah.
and is that something we need to tackle in statute or?
No, I don't believe so. I think that we can tackle it.
Senator Williams.
Each municipality is, I think, is required now to have a local emergency management plan. This could almost be an annex to that.
Yeah, and Sonia, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because this is some of the work that you do in PEL.
Sure, I would just say that we at Vermont Emergency Management, when we're working with all of the local emergency managers, the directors there, we always encourage the sharing of plans within their local communities. So in case there's a response need, they're familiar with what processes within their individual schools and their communities.
Absolutely. So there should be a really fruitful cross-pollination happening between these plans, and that's, I think, VEM is really messaging that to their municipalities that they're working with as well. So I think we have a moment of opportunity here, and I think the July flooding was, I was going to say a watershed moment, but that's the parable pun, and it's just the word that came to mind, so. Okay, one thing I do want to indicate, is, and I'll sort of, this lies further down in the slide deck, but this is the moment to discuss it. Because this work around emergency operations planning does need to be thoughtful, planful. Folks are busy. It really does need to engage with local first responders and emergency management folks. It's the recommendation of the School Safety Center, DPS, and AOE that this deadline actually be extended. This is something that we really feel should be done with rigor and fidelity. And we also know that for, at minimum, our SDs and SDs, they have emergency operations plans. It's not like they're out there with nothing. So there's not this great risk. And I would also, I'm going to hazard a guess here that all of our larger independent schools also have some level of emergency operations plan as well. So we do have a recommendation. We can give you statutory language for this, that deadline be extended out to July of 2025. But we are going to be releasing this template, the REMS trainings, and we'll be really working with schools to ensure that they're not procrastinating on this one. All right. Access control and visitor management, I think we can do this pretty briefly because it's along the same lines as the drill reporting.
And just so you know, we are approaching time. We can go over a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we'll kind of cruise through this section really briefly. They needed to develop policy. Most of them have done it. It's in the assurances. We do have some caveat language that was included in there around if a school recognizes a need to leave a specific structure unlocked, and it called out kind of what the legislative intent was there. I'll signal that some of our independent schools are actually using that caveat language in their policy. It doesn't make sense for them to pass a policy for which they're automatically out of compliance. But what I want to signal here is that those access controls, things like key locks, door cameras, those sorts of things are expensive. And there is no identified funding source for that. So it's just something for all of us to consider. How do we resource school safety and specifically that infrastructure need? Because our independent schools and our public schools are sort of signaling like, this is not something that we necessarily can pay for. So all right. Let's move to the behavior spread assessment. I think Dee, as I was walking in, was indicating and sharing that the sort of initial work that needed to be done in Act 29 with the development of a model policy. We have, and I'm on slide 19. We did engage in a pretty lengthy and in-depth stakeholder engagement that included a lot of the advocacy groups that you heard from last session. That model policy was released on December 1. There was public comment. And at this moment, AOE Legal Counsel is really reviewing that public comment. I acknowledge that it's late, but I would also say that this model policy is basically foundational to all of the work that will follow from it. And that some of the public comment and stakeholder feedback that was given needs really careful consideration. And so we're taking that additional time to ensure that this is done very well. As a sort of order of operations, once that model policy is released, the next round of work is going to be looking at all of the VTA guidance that has already been published and ensure that it actually lines up with the model policy, and then identify what are the tools that our schools need to be able to implement VTA teams. The final thing I'll share is that there is also sort of an immediate requirement around current VTA teams. So there's all of these different requirements within Act 29, and it sort of calls out, if you've got a current VTA team, you need to be in compliance with this by the start, essentially, of the next school year. Our intention is to support current teams in that process. One of the ways that we're intending to do this is you all have a Budget Adjustment Act request for $50,000 because there was no funding identified for that work.
You gave it to the House, correct?
We did give it to the
Yeah,
House,
okay.
yeah, you'll be getting
They're
that
still working on it.
presentation. And we've identified how we plan to use that money. We're going to be holding a one-day conference / workshop in late spring. It will include sort of an introduction to the model policy, new procedures and tools, and critically, some diversity, equity, and inclusion training. We've been working really closely with the Office of Racial Equity. They've been great partners in evaluating our current training, offering suggestions. And then moving forward into the future, what I would say about VTA and something that I think we have a strong consensus across all the agencies is that VTA is a program and it should be treated as such. We can check the box and implement and say, oh, we've got teams, they've all been identified, they're all going to do their reporting. But really, if we want to do this in a way that has the rigor and fidelity of what's intended in Act 29, and I think what our advocacy groups want to ensure that we are not disproportionately impacting marginalized students, that we are doing this in a way that's effective, that it is not a law enforcement activity, but is one of a part of multi-tiered system of support, that we should treat it as a program. And so again, I'm sort of identifying future need for resources, that if we're going to do this well, we need to resource it.
If as part of MTSS, is it tier 3? I mean, like, where would you place it on the?
I would wanna, I think that what we haven't yet done is had an opportunity to actually engage with our AOE MTSS team. We've been talking to them, but we haven't dug in yet. And so identifying where it is, I think it really depends on the student and what the sort of behaviors are, right? So is this a student who is just having some challenging behaviors? Is this a student that is potentially a real risk of certain danger to themselves or others? And so then what are the appropriate levels of support that it should provide? But we want to work with our MTSS team to really think about how to integrate it.
And I know we're running out of time, but this may be a bizarre question, but how is truancy playing into this?
That's really interesting. I happen to be sitting in a conversation about that right now. So I don't know that we have a handle necessarily on how those things are interacting, and I think it's why we need to integrate it into these larger conversations. So there is a conversation that's happening right now around chronic absenteeism, redefining truancy. I would certainly invite you to have Anne Bordenau come in to discuss that work. I'm not the expert, I'm a fly on the wall in those conversations. But again, how do we treat this as an integrated thing, and how might chronic absenteeism be an indicator of other issues that we need to engage with?
Yes, thank you.
Senator Sheem, I know you have a 4 o'clock meeting, you mentioned. Do you have any questions for our witness?
I do not, but thank you.
All right. Thank you for letting me breathe through that as quickly as possible.
Any other questions?
Well, it's just curious on your emergency operations. Are you discovering it? You said that a lot of schools already have emergency operations plans, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But in your rollout, are you seeing that schools, like, are there areas that schools seem to have to now incorporate? Like, is there a common thread on what you're requesting them to add into their EOPs?
Sunny, do you have anything in particular? I've got 1 or 2 examples that pop out for me.
I think the things that popped into my head are we've added some new annexes for consideration. I think especially including, what to do in flooding situations, which might not have previously been included in some EOPs. But I would say adding support mechanisms around, specific threats is what comes to
Yeah.
mind.
That I was gonna say the same thing. There's been recent instances that have indicated that folks might need to beef up their response to potentially hazardous or dangerous materials or items on campuses. We're also encouraging as like VDH has some health initiatives that are rolling out, like Stop the Bleed or the provision of naloxone, Narcan. That should be integrated into their EOP planning. How do you respond to a suspected overdose on campus? Unfortunately, is something that everyone should be prepared for, even if we're not seeing that happen on school campuses. Thank you. Then we want them to be prepared for it, and it should be integrated into their EOP plan.
Okay, good. And then just final question, very quick. In your EOP plans, are you envisioning the schools as being kind of like a community center for not preparedness, but reaction to the natural disasters or incidents of various types?
Yeah, so this is something that's actually very close to my heart because I also do school construction and facilities, as Senator Kulik knows. And I think that we really need to start to understand that our school buildings serve as critical community resources during all kinds of emergencies, flooding, power outages, blizzards, all sorts. And we need to ensure that those buildings are resilient and that they can function as such. So for those who are already identified as emergency shelters, certainly that should be in their EOP plans. And I would be looking out for that as we're supporting them. But I think that we should consider that more broadly. Because I think they're critical community infrastructure and should be treated as such, if I'm gonna get on my soapbox.
Ms. Barber, when we were looking at this bill last year, was there discussion around the state colleges and UVM as it relates to school safety?
Not specifically,
Or even the independent colleges?
I will say this, the University of Vermont was just awarded a federal grant to look at this very topic. So what they are doing is embarking on offering threat assessment training to all of the colleges and universities in Vermont, and also large and middle level employers, mid-sized employers. The great thing about it is they put out the RFP for who would provide that training, and it is the same. The RFP was awarded to the same group that's doing the threat assessment training that we have been doing for the last several years and are continuing to do in our K through 12 schools. So there's going to be this great continuity from what's happening in our K through 12 schools to what's happening in our IHEs. So, but there is work being done in that realm, and UVM, if you go to their website, there's a link. I couldn't direct you exactly how to get to it, but you can find it, and it goes into what their plan is for that training for the next year anyway.
That's super. Yeah. Any comments from you, Ms. Barbick, or anyone else on your team?
To Jill's point, a lot of incredible amounts of work have gone into Act 29, and some of the dates are aggressive, and we're finding that as we're embarking on this road. So just that we're mindful of that.
You may come back if you, at some point to us, I suspect, to propose additional time.
Certainly, at this point, it's the EOP plan specifically that we've identified that date is, I think, probably too aggressive for folks to do it in the way that we want them to do it. We are applying for some federal/state money to support a consultant for the VTA implementation. I think that's a critical resource that we need. It's not expertise that we necessarily have in-house at this point. And so I'll just identify that that's a resource need that we're trying to fill. And that, hopefully we get that, but might hear from us again.
Yeah, and the sooner you can get language to the committee, to Morgan, the better. We do a miscellaneous education bill that we'll start to put together.
Yeah.
And that would be great to get that in there.
We can definitely commit to getting that to her.
Anything else?
Apologize again for the scheduling. stuff.
No, it's.
Thank you for.
Great, thanks for all that you're doing.
Early in the
Great
session,
seeing all of
early
you.
days.
Great seeing you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will go back to my
Very
construction task force report.
Ms. Myers, when you're arrived. Here's in about 15-20 minutes with, at 4:30, we're going to hear from, Julie Richard. To respond to the question she's gonna call you. I'd like to hear something. I'd like to.
Any process before they're.
I'll stay here so we have a forum.
No, we are,
Chelsea's just trying to get in.
we're just waiting for with us. Yeah, but you know what I'm.
I know it. I was gonna go, but if the chairman wants to get.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, literally, 4:30 versus 4:35. I mean,
I'll stay.
you know.
I'm here.
Coffee. Okay, I'll stay here all day.
Ms. Myers, we're under a time crunch.
Okay, we'll be quick, we'll talk quick.
Great, thank you both. You're testifying together?
Yeah.
Ms. Myers and Mr. McGrath. Ms. Myers is from the Vermont Superintendent Association, Mr. McRae.
Yeah.
Is it?
Cool.
Am I right? Well, I don't want to be wrong.
Mick Wraith.
McRae, Mr. McRae, thank you, is the Assistant Executive Director of the Vermont Principal Association. And we are talking about S87. And we asked our usual suspects, if you will, in the public education realm, to weigh in on the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I've got some prepared testimony and we'll send it to you if we haven't already. Thank you for inviting us to provide testimony on behalf of the Superintendent Association and the Principal Association on the proposed S87. Holocaust education promotes awareness, empathy, collective responsibility to prevent such atrocities in the future, fostering society's commitment to justice, human rights, and the preservation of peace. As S87 states, according to the Anti-Defamation League, over the past decade, there has been a marked surge in anti-Semitic and racist violence in the United States and Europe. By learning about the systemic state-sanctioned genocide of 6 million Jews and other marginalized groups, students gain a profound understanding of the consequences of unchecked prejudice and hatred. We fully support the continued teaching of Holocaust education in Vermont schools. We unequivocally believe that all Vermont schools should be teaching students about the Holocaust. Indeed, it is part of the curriculum in our public schools. To the best of our knowledge, if passed, S87 would be the first piece of legislation to mandate curriculum in Vermont. This would be a significant shift from how Vermont has previously legislated around what educators teach in schools. Currently, to quote the Agency of Education's recent testimony about the regulatory framework surrounding curriculum, Vermont's regulatory structure directs local boards to set graduation requirements and develop and select curriculum, methods of instruction, locally developed assessments, and the content and skills to be learned within a supervisory union. Supervisory union boards are responsible for ensuring alignment to state adopted standards, and those standards need to be inclusive of the minimum course of study delineated in the relevant statutes. VSA and VPA took note of the Agency of Education's call to align proposed legislation within the implementation of the proposed education quality standards and subsequent ethnic and social equity content standards. That work currently sits with the State Board of Education for their consideration for adoption. When adopted, these rules and standards will require each school district to provide learning opportunities that allow students to demonstrate proficiency in ethnic and social equity studies, including the definition of ethnic groups as defined in Act 1 of 2019, which states, in part, groups that have been historically subject to persecution or genocide. As of December 7th, 2023, the proposed revisions to the educational quality standards define ethnic groups exactly as it was stated in Act 1 of 2019. The State Board of Education signaled its duty to consider the adoption of ethnic and social equity content standards and appointed the subcommittee to begin this work September 20, 2023, according to their meeting minutes. Act 175 of 2022 stated that on or before January 15th, 2023, is 24.
24.
24.
Sorry, yeah, 24.
24, the Agency of Education shall issue a written report to the state and House committees on education on the status of the Holocaust education in public schools and its recommendations to ensure that Holocaust education is included in the educational programs provided to the students in public schools. That report has not yet been able to be provided. We have noted the important partnership with the Vermont Holocaust Museum to develop ongoing professional learning and resources to schools around the state. And based on some recent conversations anecdotally with educators, Holocaust education is currently embedded intentionally into deeper unit studies in line with the C3 content standards and connected to transferable skills. The importance of the Holocaust education cannot be overstated. This is a vital piece of learning that continues to occur in our schools throughout the state. And we hope that you'll consider to continue taking testimony from educators leading this work.
Can I ask a specific question? So you're representing the principals and the superintendent?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, so the bill had a very specific outline of the scope of study as far as like the number of hours per year or the number of hours and that it's an annual, recommended as an annual training education requirement. Do you agree with that level? Is that something you're willing to? It was 6 hours per year. Is that?
I think we would point to the part in our testimony that calls on us to consider what we've historically done around curriculum in the state of Vermont. And if the legislature is going to move in the direction of mandating curriculum, considering that within the context of the education regulatory framework moving forward.
Okay, can you?
I can explain.
Okay, so
So do you want to just say it quickly?
Yeah, sure, I'll try to
yes.
rephrase.
Yeah.
Currently, the legislature does not dictate the curriculum. And so I think we would stand, or answer that question with that 6 hours, 12 hours would still be within the realm of dictating curriculum.
But yeah, it's definitely a legislation of curriculum.
Yes.
Right? But I'm curious if you've been able to get with your constituents about, the impact on their other annual training requirements, education requirements. If the impact of 6 hours is.
So I did have the opportunity to speak to a few curriculum leaders that I was with yesterday, so I can't speak broadly from the superintendent's perspective on this question, but what I did learn from those curriculum directors is that putting some constraints around the hours might actually kind of reverse the course of that deeper learning opportunity when it's embedded within like the framework of the standards. So we would have fear, I'm not saying that it would happen, that the 6 hours would become more of a check mark each year rather than an intentional additive to the coursework. So like, putting some context around it and framework, we wouldn't want it to just become, okay, we're required to do 6 hours, so we're gonna check that off. When currently we believe that that Holocaust education is very intentionally built within the framework of their coursework in schools.
Okay.
I cannot speak to the superintendents at large on that, so I'm just gonna quick phrase that from the curriculum directors I've spoken with.
Would you pass me your testimony,
Yes.
please? And would you email it, please,
Yes.
to Morgan as soon as possible? Just
Yes,
because
you
I
bet.
think there's some key things in there that we want to follow up. Oh, yes, please.
Mike, would you add to that question or?
I agree. Yeah. And, your question is around, I think you, said the word training, then corrected, right?
It's a background problem.
Right, and I think that may speak to a concern that I would have personally around it, right? Is we wouldn't want it to be considered a training. I think our schools are taking
Yeah, I
it
agree.
taking it very seriously and doing in-depth work around it. And we want to make sure that that's the case and continue to do that.
My apologies, using the word training was something just, given my background, it's just.
I understand.
So education, I meant education.
Yeah.
I think is important to think about like the resources that the agency is requiring and our educators, do they feel equipped to teach Holocaust studies? And I think that status report that was required would have been a pretty good opportunity to look at, like, are educators equipped with the knowledge to be able to effectively teach about about Holocaust education? And it's unfortunate we haven't been able to dig into that question a little bit more.
Mr. Fannin. Guys, mind sticking around for about 5 more minutes?
we don't.
Yes. No, you're there. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. I just had a quick question, Jeff, before you jump in, and sort of statement / question. You mentioned that there's no that we don't dictate curriculum in the
Best of our knowledge.
And so I'm gonna push back a little bit and commit to more learning, because I'm not an expert in this, but it seems like yesterday, we didn't do a deep mining of Title 16, but we did pick up fairly quickly that it looks like tobacco and alcohol education is mandated in statute. So that is like one area where we do dictate curriculum. And then, like I said, we didn't go deep into Title 16, but Ledge Council thought that there might be other instances. So I guess it's not, I don't know if we can make that blanket statement.
It's not as pure as I think, even I thought it was
Right.
before yesterday.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, for what it's worth.
Mr. Fannin.
Yes.
You
Hello.
have Fannин's testimony.
Yes, I submitted to Morgan a little bit earlier. I think you have that.
We do. Thank you very much. Floor is
All right,
yours.
all right, thank you for inviting me to speak with you about S87, the Holocaust Studies Bill. We fully support the continued teaching of the Holocaust in Vermont schools. Indeed, it is vital that we never forget the horrors of the Holocaust and that our students learn about the atrocities committed against the Jewish people. As was pointed out yesterday, however, we think the bill would best accomplish its stated goals by requiring the proposed Act 1 standards to be revised to include teaching about the Holocaust. The Education Quality Standards, or EQS, being revised by Act 1's racial equity standards, is the logical place to include teaching about the Holocaust. And all schools that receive public education fund money should be required to adhere to these new standards. And it's not too late. While amending, excuse me?
Nothing.
Okay. While amending the new Act standards makes good sense, what we at Vermont NEA know is that almost every student graduates having received lessons in the Holocaust. Indeed, when I unscientifically, admittedly, asked teachers last fall, we have a fall tour, if you will, meetings around the state, whether they were teaching about the Holocaust, most laughed at me and said, of course we are teaching about the Holocaust. And I believe you've heard from teachers in the AOE about how the existing, and again, Mike here and Chelsea, that how the existing social studies and language arts standards already include Holocaust standards. And these standards are, we commonly refer to as C3 and the Common Core standards, as well as the Portrait of a Graduate. They do not mandate how or what specific content within the Holocaust to teach, but they specify the skills we want all students to be able to acquire through their lessons and discussions. As the AOE pointed out yesterday, that is the Vermont tradition, establishing state standards that local school boards, curriculum directors, and teachers then implement. Notwithstanding the fact that Vermont's public schools already are teaching about the Holocaust and the state has Holocaust standards, both of which Vermont NEA supports, Vermont NEA opposes S187 for technical and long-standing reasons that you just discussed, really. Requiring what to teach and how to teach a specific subject runs counter to the state's approach to locally accountable public community-supported schools, which Vermont NEA has always supported. It also misses the fact that Vermont's professional teachers are teaching in the Holocaust now, as prescribed by these above-listed standards. But if a teacher is not teaching about the Holocaust, then that needs to be addressed locally and not through a bill. And finally, if you insist on passing the bill, at a minimum, Section 5, the effective date should be amended to say that the requirements in the bill are not effective unless and until the agency hires an employee who is responsible for the technical assistance required of the agency. Without that change, schools will be left with a requirement, but no support as envisioned by the bill. Thank you. And happy to answer some questions if you have any.
Any questions for Mr. Fenn? Good. Is Ms. Richter here yet? She said she was gonna be here first. Okay.
Thank you
Yes.
very much.
We do have a question. from
Sorry,
Senator
Jeff.
Hewitt.
I'm sorry.
What would the technical assistance look like? What do you envision with a technical assistance?
I don't know. I know that the bill calls for it, and that might need to be fleshed out a bit.
Okay.
And I think it's
But
also,
certainly-
go ahead, sorry.
I'm sorry, but certainly the person, there would be a person, a human being
Yeah.
doing that work that currently is not being asked of the agency. We want to make sure that that person's in place to give the support to the schools to do the work.
And I think you're not, I'll say it, I have concerns that the agency is understaffed, and this would certainly go right to that issue, the heart of that issue, making certain that if we add additional responsibilities to the agency, we have increased staffing. And frankly, it goes along with a lot of the conversations we've been having around a range of issues, making certain that schools have the support and making certain that certain things are being done that we're hoping that they do, asking them to do.
Agreed.
Anything else before we shift to a quick fiscal update with Ms. Richter? Perfect timing.
Can I just
Yes, please.
conclude with, I think that hearing from curriculum directors is super important because they can put it within the context of the overall picture better than I think Mike and I can do. So.
You know, yes, I appreciate that very much. I think right now the committee has had enough testimony where I think the committee can maybe over the weekend think about this and decide which direction you want to go.
Sounds good.
Can I ask one question about Mike and Chelsea? So what region of the state are you from? Like, where's your experience?
It's a good question. Now that I've worked in the statewide role, for the last 4.5 years, you start to get a better sense of the whole state, which has been really one of the best parts of the job. But I worked and lived in Franklin County. I was a school counselor and middle school principal in Enosburg, and then I was high school principal in Montpelier, and I live in Chittenden County now.
Okay, good.
My experience is from out of state, though I'm born and raised multi-generation Vermont family. So I came back to join the Vermont Superintendents Association from other states.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you both.
Thanks. Nice to see you all in person.
Good to see you too. Ms. Richter, do you mind joining us? We have just a couple of questions, I think, for you, and thank you for jumping in like this.
Yes,
We
happy
really
to
appreciate,
help.
we know you had a very busy day because I believe the emergency board met.
Yes, that's why I wasn't able to join you earlier.
Yes, yeah, so thank you very much. Really grateful. And I think we'll be relatively quick in our question. We're wondering.
Never mind.
No.
Seems like a year ago.
One of the things that the committee was wondering is, has a list started to be compiled of districts around what their budgets are going to look like, where the increases are, where there might be decreases? Is that kind of information available? Is that really?
Yeah, so we're beginning, our only source is the paper or the superintendent's contract.
He's talking about, that's not just you and Senator Terry.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant to do like this. So we're just curious if we asked the School Boards Association if they had started compiling a list of expected budget impacts, whether positive or negative. So anyways, then it was thought that maybe JFO had collecting such Kathy?
Sure. So for the record, Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. Unfortunately, I can't say yes, we have that list yet, and I can provide some context as to why not and what that will look like. So school budgets are in the process, as you know, of building and developing their budgets. They're warning those budgets over the next couple of weeks. As that data starts to come in, that data is being sent to the Agency of Education, and the Agency of Education starts to compile that list, which they in turn will share with us, the JFO. So AOE would be the point of contact to be able to share with the committee what budgets they've seen thus far and what they look like. We do have, you know, the preliminary projections that were used in the December 1 modeling. And of course, that is stale because it was December 1 projections. With respect to changes in, I believe you were talking earlier about Act 127.
Yes.
So if the question also came up, well, what about change in weights and taxing capacity? AOE is either in the process or has just recently finalized the long-term weighted counts by school district. And so once that is finalized, then you could look at school districts to see how tax capacity is shifted, but that too is not finalized.
So do you know when AOE might get those numbers?
With respect to the long-term weighted ADM or the budget?
The budget.
That will be ongoing, so they probably.
So they have some now.
Probably,
Okay.
As a sort of a sense of timing, the yield bill usually starts with the House and House Ways and Means. So usually starting towards the end of January, I'm going in concert with my counterpart at AOE. And they're talking
Who
about
is that, my ask?
Nicole Lee, so
Is that
she
the
has
Brad
stepped into
James?
Brad James's
Okay.
role.
Thank you.
Nicole Lee, she's excellent.
Great.
And we'll go in and she'll talk about, here's what we're seeing in terms of budget data, and then I can help. This is what that looks like in the statewide head.
We can ask for both.
Good. Yeah, we don't need a perfect product.
No.
You know, just a sense that would be.
Where things are.
Sure, what are
Committee,
the
any,
next one?
I think, any other questions for Ms. Richter?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other business, questions, comments? I think we just, yes.
Can I respond to the last few folks about the Holocaust? Or is it too? Not okay.
You, well, how long? Yeah, briefly?
Just very
That'd be
briefly.
great, thank you. Yes.
Heidi
Yeah.
Fishman from Mount Holocaust Memorial. Just what the last few folks were saying, and sorry, I don't have everybody's names, but I was at the Act One meeting this morning for the House, and there's nothing about Holocaust in there. And
They're coming in just soon next week to talk to us about some of this data.
But if
Yeah.
we're relying on that, I think we're just, it's not there.
Right.
And equity is not the same as teaching history. We're talking about current classrooms, behavior, and then people being comfortable versus the history. Those are very different things. And this, you brought up the idea of, we do teach alcohol and drugs in schools, you know, that's specifically mandated. Why can't Holocaust be put in just under the whole social studies space? Very short sentence. We can include it. It's that important. We need to teach about bigotry and all the isms and racism and we need it. The students need to learn about hate. They need to learn about preserving democracy. It's as important, if not more important. They're learning about civil rights.
Just a quick conversation. So the NEA is saying that it exists in the social studies and language arts standards, include Holocaust studies.
Then I want to see it. I
Standards, okay.
haven't found it.
Okay, all right, that's helpful.
If they keep saying it's there, but we can't find it.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Do you know, Mrs. Fishman, what the technical assistance piece is in the bill?
That made no sense to
Okay.
me. I don't know what they're talking about because technically assisting, I mean, there's so many places to get curriculum from. I don't know what they're.
I mean, that bill, who wrote?
Center Alliance.
Okay.
We can ask.
If they're asking for someone to be able to count how many schools are doing it, I don't know if they're asking for
You are
that.
part of writing the bill.
No,
My impression, but I think you're raising a good point. Maybe this isn't technical, maybe it's another kind of assistance that they're really looking for. Curriculum, guidance, that sort of thing.
because that's out there, the USHM
Right,
and Echoes and Reflections, there's free materials everywhere, easy.
Right, but this, to your point, this would, my sense is this is what we would call the belly button you would push for that particular topic. You know, that's, instead of having, you know, a wide variety of, options, that this is, okay, Vermont State Agency of Education, this is the point person who coordinates.
Right, I get that. I just was hoping to have a little bit like of a background of where that came from and what more specifically they were thinking they wanted and. Would that be like a one FTE position or?
That's what it sounds.
Okay, all right, great, well, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I think there is, we should try to figure out this NEA testimony.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
didn't quite make sense to me.
What I'll ask Mr. Fannin to do, and is to point us and you to that standard. And we'll see if we
Let's-
yeah.
Yeah, if you
Yeah.
haven't found it, and he's also saying, we're teaching it.
Right.
And so if we wanna codify it, big deal, they don't have to change their behavior, if they're already doing it, but it's safe for the future when if people decide not to teach it. So if they're already teaching it, it shouldn't be bad, we just right now say, and you will teach it.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
sticking
much.
around.
Thank you. You've had a busy afternoon.